I knew the morning was going to be a disaster the second a shrill voice screeched my name like a dying smoke alarm, and when I opened my cabin door to find a red-faced woman in a leopard cardigan waving a clipboard like a weapon, I realized I was about to witness an HOA meltdown so historic it deserved its own museum wing, because Karen, yes, the universal, unstoppable, HOA-born Karen, had climbed onto my porch at 6:07 a.m. to tell me that I was trespassing on the Lakeside cabin that I not only legally owned but had inherited from my grandfather, who owned more land than the entire HOA combined. Yet she insisted I was violating 15 rules simultaneously just by breathing in the general vicinity of her neighborhood, even though the entire neighborhood sat smack in the middle of property lines her HOA didn't technically have authority over, but she refused to acknowledge that tiny detail. Because in her universe, HOA authority extended roughly as far as the Milky Way galaxy. So there I stood, half asleep, hair looking like a distressed mop, coffee mug still half full, listening to this cardigan-wrapped demon demand that I vacate her lakeside retreat immediately, which made me choke on my coffee because I had lived here far longer than her entire HOA had existed, and when I politely explained that the cabin wasn't part of the HOA, Karen planted her hands on her hips, leaned forward like a malfunctioning Jenga tower, and said, "Sir, everything is part of the HOA if I say it is," which was the moment I realized I was dealing with a rare and dangerous species known as the Supreme. HOA Karen, identifiable by her confidence level, set permanently at 400%, and her desire to control all land, water, wildlife, and possibly oxygen. Still trying to maintain my sanity, I told her I had zero intention of leaving my own property, but instead of backing down, she widened her eyes like she'd just discovered a scandal, whipped out her phone, and announced she was calling 911 to report a suspicious squatter refusing to comply with community rules. And before I could even open my mouth to protest, she had the dispatcher on speaker, telling them a dramatic Oscar-worthy tale about a hostile intruder terrorizing her lakeside community, while dramatically stepping back and pointing at me like I was armed with a chainsaw instead of wearing socks with a hole in the toe. And while I stood there trying not to laugh at her performance, I heard sirens in the distance, because of course, Karen exaggerated everything with such enthusiasm that she probably told them I was attempting to kidnap the lake. So by the time the sheriff's SUV pulled up my driveway, Karen had already rehearsed her victim face and was near crying on cue, but the sheriff, an older man who'd known my family for decades, looked at me, then at her, then back at me, and I could see the exact moment he realized he was dealing with a nuclear-level HOA problem. "Ma'am," he said, voice calm but already tired, "this cabin belongs to him." But Karen stomped her foot. Yes, actually stomped it like a toddler denied cereal, and insisted her HOA bylaws superseded county land records, which made the sheriff rub the bridge of his nose because he knew exactly how this was going to go. Karen wasn't going to stop, and the day was about to spiral into hysterical chaos. So he asked her politely to leave, and Karen, switching tactics, accused both of us of conspiring against the HOA. That was when I realized she genuinely believed she was the president of not just a neighborhood association but possibly a sovereign nation. She stormed off, swearing she would escalate this to the highest authority, which worried me for exactly 0 seconds because I knew something she didn't. My grandfather didn't just own this small patch of land. He owned the entire surrounding county, and after he passed, all of it transferred directly to me, meaning that Karen's HOA wasn't just wrong about jurisdiction. They were squatting on land they didn't legally own at all, and that little revelation was going to send Karen into a meltdown so spectacular it might crack the time-space continuum. But for now, I let her storm away, because every HOA Karen needs time to recharge her emotional chaos batteries before striking again, and sure enough, 1 hour later, here she came marching down the gravel driveway with 2 HOA board members behind her. One carrying a binder so thick it could stop a bullet, and the other wearing a neon vest like he thought he was leading traffic on a runway, ready to serve me with violations, including but not limited to unauthorized structure, my cabin from 1952, unauthorized vehicle, my truck from literally yesterday, unauthorized natural foliage, the trees, excessive water presence, the lake, and non-approved wildlife, the ducks. At which point I leaned against my porch railing and genuinely wondered if these people were trolling me or if they truly believed they had divine HOA authority granted by the universe. I laughed so hard that Karen's eyebrow twitched like she was fighting the urge to snatch my soul, and she declared that if I did not vacate by sunset, the HOA would take corrective action, which I assumed meant writing more fake violations or attempting to tow the lake. I tried explaining again that they had zero jurisdiction here, but Karen's ears were apparently decorative because she didn't absorb a single word and instead threatened to fine me $50,000 for willfully disregarding HOA sovereignty. The board members nodded like bobbleheads behind her. and I swear the one with the vest whispered "sovereignty" under his breath like it was a sacred relic. Deciding I'd entertained them long enough, I walked inside, grabbed the giant county land binder my grandfather left me. Yes, the one that literally proves I own the entire county, and brought it out, placing it on the porch table with a satisfying thud that echoed like a dramatic movie moment. And all three of them leaned forward as I opened the map to the giant highlighted section labeled with my family's name spanning miles in every direction. Karen blinked, processing absolutely none of it, then pointed to a tiny square labeled HOA Clubhouse and said, "No, we own this," as if the one building they illegally constructed somehow overpowered decades of land deeds. But before I could respond, she snatched the binder, snapped pictures, and stormed off yelling she was calling an emergency HOA meeting which, judging by her panic level, meant she was about to hyperventilate over some folding chairs and a PowerPoint. I thought the chaos was over for the day, but the universe said, nope, because 2 hours later I heard shouting near the lake, and when I went to check, Karen had gathered the entire HOA membership in a circle on the shore, giving a dramatic speech about protecting their territory from invading forces, which made me wonder if she thought she was in a medieval fantasy novel. And right as she reached the height of her speech, declaring the HOA must kick out the squatter before he seizes total control, I stepped into the clearing with the sheriff beside me, holding the official county records he'd retrieved, records that made it legally undeniable that I, in fact, owned the lake, the land, the clubhouse, the walking trails, and their entire neighborhood. And Karen froze mid-rant, color draining from her face so fast it was like watching a cartoon character shut down. And as the sheriff began reading out loud, the entire HOA crowd erupted in gasps and arguments, and one guy who fainted dramatically into a beach chair, while Karen, refusing to accept defeat, grabbed her phone and screamed she was calling 911 again to report a county-wide conspiracy, which was the moment I realized Section 1 of this story wasn't just chaos. It was the warm-up act for the nuclear meltdown that was about to unfold when this woman discovered she didn't just have no authority over me. She was technically trespassing on my land every single day. I should have known the day was about to go off the rails the moment Karen froze mid 911 call like her internal Wi-Fi disconnected, because instead of accepting reality like a normal human being, she stared at the sheriff's paperwork, then at me, then back at the paperwork, and let out a slow, high-pitched "noo" that sounded less like a person and more like an air balloon deflating, and that was when the HOA crowd, who only seconds earlier had been ready to form a pitchfork-wielding mob against me, began whispering among themselves like they just realized their beloved president had led them into battle without telling them they were, in fact, on MY land, not theirs. And just when I thought Karen's meltdown had reached peak chaos, she dramatically pointed at the sheriff and screeched, "This is fraud. This is forgery. This is a county-level hoax," while backing away like everyone except her was part of some Illuminati conspiracy, and she nearly tripped over one of the HOA lawn flamingos someone had brought for morale, which only added to the circus-like aesthetic. Meanwhile, the sheriff, who had long passed the point of caring, sighed deeply, like a man questioning every career choice he'd ever made, and calmly stated, "Ma'am, this land has been owned by his family for generations." But Karen, refusing to accept any sentence containing the words, "You are wrong," shoved her phone toward him as if showing him her HOA bylaws would override property deeds issued by the state itself. So I, being a reasonable man who enjoys watching chaos unfold with popcorn, stepped forward and said, "Karen, this entire neighborhood is sitting on land I legally own." And the collective gasp from the HOA members was so dramatic I thought someone had opened the door to a vacuum chamber, and instantly, the board members began flipping through pages of their binders like they were searching for evidence that reality was optional. Then, as if her inner Karen spirit sensed she was losing control, she pivoted to her next favorite tactic, weaponizing unnecessary drama, because she suddenly threw herself onto a picnic table bench, clutching her chest dramatically, gasping out, He can't own us," which made a few of her loyal followers rush to fan her with HOA pamphlets, but the sheriff was done and simply said, "Ma'am, this is not a monarchy," which made one old man drop his iced tea from laughing so hard. Still, Karen sprung up again, because apparently her fainting spell was a temporary software glitch, and began shouting about how the HOA would fight back with every legal tool available, which made everyone else step back because nobody wanted to be dragged into whatever legal black hole she was conjuring next. Meanwhile, I remained calm, because I knew something Karen didn't. If the HOA wanted to argue ownership, all I had to do was file one simple county-wide notice, and every structure built without proper permission, including their clubhouse, their fences, their dock, and Karen's illegally expanded patio, would be listed as unauthorized constructions on MY property, and the mere thought of that sent a wicked little spark of joy through me. And since Karen clearly wasn't going to stop until she combusted, I walked forward holding the big binder and said, "Karen, if you want to hold a meeting, let's do it properly." And the moment I suggested a meeting, the HOA crowd reacted like I'd proposed a gladiator match. Some excited, some terrified, and Karen absolutely determined to choose violence. So she marched up to me, poked my chest with her pen so hard it left an indent, and declared, "Fine. Emergency HOA meeting. No. In the clubhouse. And you're coming so you can hear every rule you're violating," which was hilarious since she still hadn't accepted that she was the one trespassing, not me. But the sheriff, sensing that letting me attend the meeting might actually prevent Karen from calling 911 a seventh time, nodded and said he'd accompany me just in case the HOA devolved into full-scale civil war, which honestly felt like a valid concern. So off we all marched, a parade of stressed homeowners trailing behind Karen like she was leading them into a cult ritual, and the moment we entered the clubhouse, a building they had proudly built without a single permit, they immediately dimmed the lights, turned on a projector, and Karen positioned herself at the front like a dictator about to give a speech that would change absolutely nothing, except maybe her blood pressure. She clicked a remote, a dramatic HOA logo slid onto the screen, and she launched into a furious PowerPoint titled, "Operation Reclaim the Lake," which included bullet points like, "Assert dominance," "Challenge trespasser legally," and "Win by any means necessary." All delivered with such intensity that even the HOA board members exchanged worried glances. I sat in the back with my arms crossed, sipping complimentary lemonade someone shoved into my hands, while the sheriff leaned forward in the chair next to me whispering, "This is better entertainment than TV," and he wasn't wrong. Karen continued her speech with increasingly unhinged explanations of how the HOA could override county land deeds through collective willpower, which I'm pretty sure is not how the law works in any universe. And then she clicked to a slide titled, "The Enemy, the Cabin Squatter," and a blurry zoomed-in picture of me taking out my trash appeared on screen like I was a wanted criminal. A few HOA members gasped, a few awkwardly coughed, and one lady whispered, "I thought he lived here longer than we did," but Karen shushed her aggressively, insisting that ownership is irrelevant when HOA bylaws are at stake, which made the sheriff choke on his lemonade. Finally, I'd heard enough nonsense, so I stood up, walked calmly to the front, clicked the remote, and replaced her dramatic slide with a picture from the county registry system showing the deed with my name printed on it in giant letters. The room went silent, completely silent, except for Karen's horrified inhaling sound, and then the chaos detonated. Board members argued among themselves, residents demanded refunds for years of illegal HOA fees, and one guy shouted, "Karen, you said you checked the maps," to which she screamed, "The maps were wrong." Which was hilarious because she was the one who drew the HOA map with crayon boundaries. But here came the best part, because while they all panicked, I took the microphone, tapped it once, and announced, "Since your development is on my land, you've all technically been tenants of mine for years," and the eruption of sheer disbelief was so loud the projector rattled. Karen screamed, "Liar!" But I continued, "Which means I get to decide what happens next," and that sentence hit the room like a meteor. A few HOA members actually cheered, which shocked Karen so much she physically recoiled, while others asked me what my landlord policies were, and Karen, realizing her rule was slipping through her fingers like wet sand, rushed to the front, shoved me aside, and yelled, "HOA power is forever," which would have been intimidating if the sheriff hadn't immediately stepped forward and said, "Ma'am, you can't overrule property law," causing Karen to scream into the void like a distant train whistle. At that point, the HOA split into factions. Team, "Maybe we should apologize," and Team, "We follow Karen no matter what." And in the middle of the shouting match, someone unplugged the projector, plunging the room into chaos, and Karen tried to lead her loyal followers in what looked like a chant but sounded more like confused mumbling. Meanwhile, I pulled out my phone and made a simple call to the county clerk's office, informing them that I wished to update my ownership records to include unauthorized HOA structures. And my voice must have carried because Karen froze, then slowly turned toward me with eyes so wide she looked like a startled owl, and whispered, "You wouldn't," and I smiled and said, "Try me," which was the moment she realized her reign of terror was crumbling, and Section 2 ended with me standing in the clubhouse, Karen clutching her binder in panic, and the entire HOA waiting to see whether I was about to evict their entire organization from MY land or simply let them sweat a little longer, because either way, the real chaos was only just beginning. I should have known things were about to shift from normal HOA chaos to full-blown apocalyptic comedy when Karen, clutching her binder like it was the last lifeboat on the Titanic, suddenly jumped onto a folding chair in the middle of the clubhouse and screamed, "The HOA will not be defeated," with such dramatic rage that the chair wobbled, tilted, and almost sent her flying into the snack table, which would have been poetic justice considering she had banned half the community from bringing snacks without snack permit forms, but she steadied herself at the last second and pointed at me with the trembling fury of a cartoon villain, yelling, "He's bluffing! He can't actually evict us!" And the entire room turned to look at me with a mix of panic, curiosity, betrayal, and, oddly, hope, because the residents who'd suffered under Karen for years were secretly rooting for their liberation. But I kept my poker face perfectly calm as I said, "On the contrary, Karen, legally, I can evict the entire HOA right now." And the gasps that filled the room were so cinematic I half expected dramatic music to begin playing, and Karen's jaw dropped so fast it almost hit the carpet. Meanwhile the sheriff, who was leaning against the wall sipping lemonade like he was watching a soap opera, muttered, "Yep, he can," and Karen whipped her head toward him so hard I was surprised she didn't sprain her neck, screeching, "You're supposed to uphold HOA law," to which the sheriff replied, "Ma'am, HOA law is not a real thing," and I swear half the room snorted trying not to laugh, but Karen, unable to let reality in without experiencing atmospheric-level fury, began flipping through her binder like she was searching for a clause that would undo the laws of the county, the state, and possibly physics, and while she frantically turned pages, the HOA crowd erupted into arguments, some asking if they could negotiate, others asking if I could take over as their new landlord king, and one elderly man cheerfully suggesting a celebratory barbecue to welcome the change in management, which caused Karen to shriek, "No barbecues without HOA permission," even. Though, ironically, the entire HOA now had the legal authority of a wet sock. Realizing I had their full attention, I raised my hand and said, "Relax, everyone. I'm not evicting you today." Not unless Karen forces my hand, and all eyes immediately snapped toward Karen in perfect unison like a laser-guided spotlight, and she recoiled dramatically like a vampire confronted with sunlight, clutching her binder as if it would protect her from the laws she couldn't control. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for, because if Karen wanted to keep fighting, I was ready to escalate, but before I could speak, she pointed at me with her trembling pen and yelled, "You're trying to overthrow the HOA. You're staging a coup," which made the sheriff laugh hard enough that lemonade almost exited his nose, and I calmly said, "A coup would imply the HOA has real political power," which caused half the room to burst into applause, but Karen doubled down, stamping her foot so hard the chair beneath her squeaked, and she declared, "The HOA is the government here," which made the room go silent, not because they agreed, but because everyone was waiting to see how I'd respond. So I walked to the front, grabbed the remote, and clicked the projector back on, revealing a giant map of the entire county with every inch highlighted in the color that represented MY ownership, including the neighborhood, the lake, the clubhouse, the roads, the walking trails, and, yes, even Karen's beloved deck that she illegally expanded without permission. I zoomed the map in dramatically and said, "This is reality. This is the law. And if you want to fight it, Karen, you're going to lose." And the HOA members whispered to each other like school kids in the back of class, and the sheriff added, "He's right, ma'am. You can't win this one, you're not the boss of the county," and Karen's face turned a shade of red I'd only seen in malfunctioning traffic lights. But instead of admitting defeat like a normal person, she tried a new tactic, denial via nonsense, yelling, "Maps can be photoshopped. Deeds can be faked. Land can be temporarily misplaced," and the room groaned as if her nonsense physically hurt their brains, while one board member quietly whispered, "I think she's lost it," and another whispered back, "She lost it 3 meetings ago." But then, Karen attempted the boldest, most Karen move in HOA history. She stepped off the chair, marched right up to me, leaned in inches from my face, and said, "If you want to challenge me, then I officially invoke Article 47B," and I blinked because I had no idea what Article 47B was supposed to be, and judging by the confused looks in the room, nobody else did either, so she repeated it louder, "Article 47B. The HOA can seize temporary control of any disputed property during an emergency." And the board members scrambled to check their binder but quickly realized something hilarious. There was no Article 47B, Karen just made it up like a child inventing rules in a playground game, and when one of the board members timidly said, that doesn't exist," Karen turned on him with such fury he backed up like she'd threatened to bite him. Meanwhile I, thoroughly entertained, said, "Karen, you can invent as many articles as you want. You still can't overrule the county," and she let out a frustrated groan, stomping her foot again, which only made the sheriff say, "Stop stomping, you're scaring the floor." But Karen threw her head back dramatically and declared, "Fine. If the law won't stop you, then the HOA will rally to protect our home." And she stormed out of the clubhouse with so much theatrical flair she looked like she was auditioning for a telenovela, leaving the entire HOA behind in stunned silence. Then the room exploded into chatter, residents asking what would happen now, others quietly begging me to take over the HOA, and one woman excitedly whispering that this was better than Netflix. So I raised my hand again and said, "Listen, everyone. I'm not here to ruin your homes. I just want peace." "But Karen, she's going to make this messy," and the sheriff nodded, muttering, "Messy is an understatement," which was proven true seconds later when we heard a loud air horn outside. Everyone rushed to the windows to see Karen standing at the edge of the lake, holding a megaphone in one hand and the HOA flag in the other, with a small group of her loyalists behind her like she was preparing for battle. She lifted the megaphone and screamed, "HOA members, gather for Operation Take Back the Territory!" And one guy behind her lit a tiki torch like they were reenacting some kind of low-budget revolution. The sheriff looked at me and said, "Oh Lord, she's forming a militia," and we walked outside just in time to hear Karen declare, "We will block the cabin, block the road, and block the lake until he leaves," and her followers cheered weakly, mostly out of fear she'd find them if they didn't. I walked straight up to her little army and said, "Karen, you're trespassing on my land." "Again," and she yelled, "Not until you prove it in HOA court," which was a new concept even for her, and I replied, "HOA court is not real," and she screamed, "IT is now," before dramatically planting the HOA flag in the dirt, on my property, as if she were claiming the land for her imaginary empire. But before I could respond, the sheriff stepped forward, picked up the flag, and handed it back to her like a disappointed dad telling a child to put away their toys, saying, "Ma'am, you can't claim land you don't own," and Karen let out a squeal of outrage that echoed across the lake like a distressed goose. Realizing she was losing control fast, she switched strategies again, this time declaring, "Fine. Everyone. Emergency door knock tonight. We gather signatures to demand he vacate the county," which made several HOA members visibly cringe, and one whispered, "Vacate the county? Does she think she's president of Earth?" And honestly, yes, she did. Meanwhile, I took a deep breath, stepped forward, and said, "Karen, I'll make you a deal," instantly silencing the crowd. "Stop this nonsense, and I won't file trespassing charges on you or the HOA," and I swear the sighs of relief from the residents were almost musical, until Karen overrode them by screeching, "Never! You can't intimidate the HOA!" But her voice cracked mid-scream, betraying the fear she was desperately trying to hide. So I leaned closer and said, just loud enough for everyone to hear, "Karen, I already scheduled a meeting with the county commissioner tomorrow," and her eyes widened like saucers because she knew exactly what that meant. If I wanted to, I could dissolve every bit of her precious HOA's illegal authority with one signed order. She stepped back, whispering to herself, "He wouldn't dare," and I smiled because she finally understood the truth. She wasn't fighting me. She was fighting the entire county, and she was losing. The HOA members stared at her, then at me, then back at her, and one brave soul finally said, "Karen, maybe we should just listen to him," and Karen spun around, betrayal on her face, screaming, "Traitor!" before running toward her golf cart, jumping in, and peeling off like a villain making a dramatic escape, except her golf cart battery was dying. So she rolled away at 2 miles per hour while everyone watched in awkward, silent confusion, and Section 3 ends right there, with Karen fleeing the scene at turtle speed, her HOA empire cracking apart, the residents turning toward me for leadership, and me preparing for the next morning, when I'd walk into the county commissioner's office and decide the fate of Karen, and the entire HOA she'd ruled with an iron binder. I should have realized the final showdown was going to be legendary the moment Karen stormed into the county commissioner's office ahead of me, hair frizzing like a lightning-struck ferret, mouth pressed so tight it looked like she'd swallowed a lemon whole, and clutching her massive HOA binder like she planned to beat the county government into submission with it, because she didn't just walk in, she burst in, slamming her binder on the commissioner's desk and shouting, "I demand you remove the illegal landowner immediately," as if she were leading a revolution, and the commissioner, who had been peacefully stirring his morning coffee, jumped so hard he spilled half of it on his tie before blinking at her like she just crawled out of the ventilation system, and when I walked in behind her, he looked at me with pure relief like, "Oh, thank God someone normal showed up," but Karen spun toward me dramatically and hissed, "You're too late. The commissioner will fix this," which was very optimistic considering she hadn't even explained what this was, so the commissioner sighed and said, "Ma'am, we haven't even started talking yet," and Karen, who knew her nonsense required zero logic and maximum volume, jabbed her finger at me and yelled, "He is trying to overthrow the HOA government of this county," which made the commissioner choke on air because HOA and government should never appear in the same sentence. Meanwhile, I simply handed the commissioner the folder containing the deeds, the maps, the generational ownership documents, and the survey records, all neatly organized, and said, "I'm the landowner. Here's everything," and the commissioner opened the folder, scanned the first page, and said the words that made Karen's soul almost leave her body, "Well, this is all valid," and Karen let out a sound like an angry kettle boiling over, slamming her palms on the desk as she screeched, "Check again!" But the commissioner calmly replied, "Ma'am, the only thing I might check again is my blood pressure," which nearly made me laugh out loud. Then came Karen's meltdown phase 2. She launched into a dramatic monologue about HOA sovereignty, community jurisdiction, and ancient bylaws, waving her binder around so violently that several paper clips flew out like shrapnel, and one hit the commissioner in the forehead. But instead of backing down, he just handed her the paperclip like, "Please stop assaulting the county." But Karen was on a mission, ranting that her HOA has ruled this land with dignity and discipline for 11 years, to which I replied, "You find a guy for having blue recycling bins," and she screamed, "They were visually disruptive," proving my point beautifully. Finally the commissioner peered over his glasses and said, "Ma'am, you do not rule anything. This entire region is under the legal ownership of," and before he could finish, Karen shoved her binder toward him and yelled, "Check Chapter 6. Chapter 6 proves everything." So the commissioner, who clearly stopped caring, opened her binder, stared at a page covered in highlighter explosions, stickers, glitter glue, and a hand-drawn map that looked like a pirate treasure sketch drawn by a toddler, and said, "Ma'am, this is arts and crafts, not legal documentation," which made the HOA board member standing behind her whisper, "She made that in the clubhouse last Thursday." But Karen ignored him and stomped her foot so hard the commissioner's pens rattled. Sensing this was going nowhere, I politely said, "Commissioner, I would like to register formal notice. The HOA has been operating and building structures illegally on my land," and Karen shrieked, "No!" like a villain watching their lair explode in a movie, but it was too late. The commissioner stamped the papers with a heavy thump that echoed around the room like a victory gong, and said, "Notice accepted," which caused Karen's last strand of sanity to snap like an over-tightened rubber band. Immediately, she lunged forward, grabbed the stamp from the commissioner's hand, and shouted, "You can't do that without HOA approval!" And the commissioner calmly took it back while saying, "Ma'am, this is the county, not a lemonade stand." But Karen wasn't done. No, she escalated to phase 3, all-out meltdown. She pointed at me with shaking fury and yelled, "If the county won't stop him, the HOA will." Then spun around dramatically and yelled at her board members, "Emergency meeting! No! Everyone to the clubhouse!" And even though we were in the middle of County Hall, her loyalists actually saluted and ran out like they were defecting soldiers, while the commissioner looked at me with the expression of a man who had just seen the face of doom. Well, of course I followed them, because if Karen wanted to make a final stand, I wanted to witness every glorious second of it, and when I arrived at the clubhouse, the scene was so chaotic, I briefly wondered if I'd walked onto a movie set. Karen was on the stage, waving the HOA flag in one hand and her binder in the other, shouting into a megaphone she absolutely did not need, "The landowner has declared war on U.S., while her followers arranged folding chairs like makeshift barricades, and one guy was duct-taping 2 pool noodles together for defense, and the sheriff, who had arrived 5 minutes before me, was standing in the corner saying, "Nobody touch anything. Legally, all of this is his now," and I couldn't help but grin. As I walked in, the moment Karen spotted me, she pointed dramatically and screamed, "Intruder!" and her loyalists charged forward, at a speed so slow it felt like slow motion, because it turns out the people who join HOAs for power are not the people who train for battle, and they froze halfway when they realized charging at the man who owned their homes wasn't a good life choice. I raised my hand for silence, and surprisingly, they obeyed. So I said, "Everyone calm down. The county has acknowledged my ownership. I'm not evicting anyone, unless Karen pushes it," and instantly the entire room turned toward Karen like she was the final boss in a video game, and you could see the panic flicker across her face. But she was Karen, so instead of surrendering gracefully, she lifted her megaphone and yelled, "We will file an appeal," to which the sheriff responded, "Ma'am, you can't appeal property law," and she yelled, "Watch me," and grabbed a stack of HOA official forms, all of which were laminated and color-coded but legally worthless, and began handing them out like medieval battle orders. But this time, nobody took them. One by one, the residents put their hands up and said things like, "Karen, we're done. You said you checked the ownership. You made us pay fines for mailbox heights," and "I'm not fighting the man who owns my mortgage," and Karen's face twisted with betrayal as they turned on her. One board member stood up and announced, "I motion to remove Karen as HOA president," and the room erupted with cheers so loud Karen nearly dropped her megaphone. She screamed, "No! You can't oust me. I am the HOA," and the sheriff whispered to me, "I've arrested less dramatic people for public disturbance," but before he could finish, the entire board unanimously voted her out in under 10 seconds, fastest political collapse in HOA history, and Karen staggered backward like she'd been struck by lightning. Then the board turned to me and said, "Sir, "Would you like to be the new HOA president?" And I replied, "Absolutely not." And the room laughed because they knew exactly why. But instead I said, "I'm dissolving the HOA entirely," and the cheer that erupted shook the dust off the rafters. Karen screamed in protest, but the sheriff guided her gently to a chair, saying, "Ma'am, sit before you face plant," and the commissioner, who arrived just in time to witness the end, stepped forward and declared, "Effective immediately, the Lakeside HOA is dissolved under county ruling," stamping the order with a dramatic thud. Karen let out one last gasp, clutching her binder as though mourning a fallen comrade, whispering, My rules!" But the residents erupted into celebration. People hugged, someone popped a soda bottle like champagne, one guy tore up his old HOA violation letters and threw them like confetti, and the elderly man who wanted a barbecue earlier yelled, "Finally! We're free!" and immediately rolled out a grill. As for Karen, defeated, binder limp in her hands, she muttered, "This isn't over." But then her golf cart battery died again, leaving her to slowly roll away from the clubhouse at a humiliating snail pace while the entire neighborhood celebrated the end of her tyrannical reign. Residents came up to me thanking me, shaking my hand, offering homemade cookies and invitations to future lake parties. And one woman said, "You didn't just beat her, you saved us," which made me laugh because I hadn't planned to be anyone's hero. I just wanted a peaceful lakeside cabin. But as I walked back toward my cabin with the sun setting and the sheriff patting me on the shoulder saying, "You handled that better than most governments," I couldn't help but enjoy the moment. Karen was gone, the HOA was dead, the county was on my side, and I finally had my land back in peace. And thus ends Section 4, with Karen rolling away in a dying golf cart, the HOA dissolved, the neighborhood throwing a liberation barbecue, and me standing at the edge of my lake knowing one simple truth. Never, ever underestimate a landowner with paperwork, especially when the entire county belongs to him.